Director General of USI, General Sharmaji, General Goswamiji, members of the USI, dear colleagues, thank you very much for such a warm introduction. It is indeed a privilege to speak before you today in this hallowed institution which since 1947 has been fostering debate and disseminating knowledge about how best India can organize its defenses. Many generations of this country's war fighters have benefited from USI's work. I have 24 pages in front of me, so brace yourselves. But the history of USI goes deeper, back to 1870 when General Charles Metcalfe MacGregor founded it for the benefit of the British Defence Services in India. Although the Brits had collectively called them the Indian Army, in fact, it was the British Army for the preservation of the colonial rule. MacGregor himself, who at one time was the chief of military intelligence in India, wrote in his book, The Defense of India, published in 1884, I quote, "I earnestly appeal to each one who reads my paper to do all that lies in his power to aid in the great work which it recommends. For that work is no less than the preservation of our Indian empire," unquote. The challenge that MacGregor was anxiously tackling in his writings was none other than the so-called Russian menace that the perfidious Albin has continuously been so obsessed about. You will not be surprised to hear from me that nearly 150 years later, British foreign policy allies are still paranoid about it. That mental condition cannot be easily explained in rational terms. One may perhaps ascribe it to the still lingering psychological trauma of losing their ill-gotten empire, or the enmity that their establishment over the centuries has been projecting towards Russia. Be that as it may, many of the confrontational policy turns may have been influenced by it. From the Fulton speech by Winston Churchill in 1946 that heralded the beginning of the Cold War against the Soviet Union, to the present day UK prime ministers declaring their intent to send troops to Ukraine to confront the Russian army. For the purposes of my talk today, it is important to bear in mind that Europe has always harbored a suspicion, often escalating to the level of undisguised hostility towards Russia, as it has displayed so conspicuously over the past 3 years. But let us be analytical in our approach and examine step by step how the raging conflict in Ukraine and the resulting European crisis are the fault of the West. I will speak then to the steps that should be taken to put an end to the bloodshed. First, let us start with geopolitics and Russia's vulnerabilities as a continental power. Unlike India, which is protected by the ocean to its west and the ocean to its east and the Himalayas to the north, Russia's vast plains, particularly in its western regions, lack natural defensive barriers like large rivers and mountains, leaving it open to land-based incursions. That circumstance was on full display during Napoleon's invasion in 1812, the First World War in 1914 and 18, and the Second World War when on 22nd of June 1947, Adolf Hitler launched his onslaught against the Soviet Union. In all these campaigns, the Russian army, when faced with overwhelming odds, had the benefit of being able to execute a fighting retreat, trading space for time in order to mobilize fresh forces, ramp up production of armaments, and receive help from allies. That was only possible because of strategic depth, a buffer that we could place between the adversary and the country's vital centers critical for sustaining the nation. The lack of strategic depth can be catastrophic, as evidenced by rapid defeats inflicted by Germany on Poland in 1939 and France in 1940. Unlike their tragic fate, the British Expeditionary Force, although defeated in France in May 1940, managed to escape to the UK and separated by the English Channel from the Nazi Germany over time, rebuilt its fighting strength and went on the offensive against the Reich in North Africa, Italy, and France. A takeaway from these examples is that Russia has traditionally placed a large premium on strategic depth in the West, trying to put as much geographical space between itself and its allies on the one hand and potential adversaries on the other, in order to be in a position with Russia, preventing hostile military alliances from encroaching on its borders. As you may have noticed, when we discussed Russia's experiences with being invaded, we focused on France, Germany, Poland, while Ukraine almost inevitably figured in the conflicts as the battlefield for fighting off the invaders. Therefore, from our perspective, these actors matter most for Russia's security perceptions in Europe. It is thus not surprising that all of them play a prominent role in the events of the Ukrainian crisis. As it emerged in the international arena in 1991, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine has experienced a split identity reflecting a history of being involved in the centuries past in the orbits of several other powers that were often hostile to one another. As a result, now Ukraine is badly divided between its Russian-speaking East and Ukrainian-speaking West. Its internal politics since independence has painted a picture of a lack of national cohesion and powerful domestic forces pulling in opposite directions. That made Ukraine vulnerable to meddling from the Western countries that finally carried out a regime change in Kyiv in 2014. But before we come to that, let us look at the preceding events from a realist standpoint. Let us talk about the causes of the Ukraine conflict. In doing so, you have to come at it from three different perspectives. First of all, you have to ask, what are the deep causes of the crisis? What are the structural factors that underpin this conflict? I think the facts are quite clear on this, that the West is responsible. And my point is that the main deep cause, the aim of the Western powers has been to peel Ukraine away from Russia's orbit and incorporate it into the West. The West's basic goal has been to make Ukraine the Western bulwark on Russia's border. But Russia says this is not happening, and we will do everything we can to make sure it does not happen. This is the deep cause. Now take it a step further. There are three key elements in Western strategy. The first is NATO expansion, and in many ways the most important. As you know, since the Cold War ended, the West, starting with the Clinton administration in the United States, has been moving NATO eastward towards Russia's borders. Russia has made it abundantly clear that it was unacceptable. What is the threat of NATO expansion? And why is it such a concern for Russia? NATO was a mortal enemy of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It is a military alliance which has at its heart the United States of America with its powerful military capabilities. It is perfectly understandable that Russia is not going to want this military alliance at its doorstep. To be fair, in the past, knowledgeable US foreign policy practitioners warned against NATO expansion. For instance, former American diplomat George Kennan, known as the author of the Strategy of Containment of Soviet Communism, stated that expanding NATO would be the most fateful era of the American foreign policy and the beginning of a new Cold War. In 1997, a group of 50 prominent US foreign policy experts, including former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and former senators, retired military officers, diplomats, and academics, sent an open letter to President Clinton outlining their opposition to NATO expansion and arguing that the current US, this is also a quotation, the current US-led effort to expand NATO is a policy error of historical proportions. We believe that NATO expansion will decrease Allied security and unsettle European stability, unquote. Alas, their dissenting voices were suppressed by the loud noise generated by American neocons who, after victory in the Cold War, prophesied the end of history and an everlasting triumph of a global order dominated by the West. Coming back to dissecting the Western strategy, its second prong is the EU expansion. EU expansion is all about integrating Ukraine economically into the West, the way that the Czech Republic, Slovakia, the Baltic states were absorbed before. These are two sets of institutions, NATO, a military institution, the EU, an economic institution. The idea, again, is to take Ukraine, peel it away from Russia, and make it a part of the West. The third part of the story is fostering a regime change, also known as color revolutions in the post-Soviet space. Now, defunct USAID, as you know from your own region of South Asia, was one of the vehicles for destabilizing and ultimately toppling foreign governments. And it has been put to its destructive use in Ukraine. And so NATO expansion, EU expansion, and destabilizing Ukraine government. I will say a bit more about NATO expansion because it is so important. NATO expansion took place in several tranches. The first one was in 1999. That is when you get Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary incorporated into NATO. The second tranche was in 2004, and that is when the Baltic states and Romania and Slovakia and Slovenia were absorbed. All this while, Moscow made it clear that it was adamantly opposed to NATO expansion, but with domestic turmoil and economic distress in Russia in 1990s, there was little it could actually do. But then the trouble starts, and it comes at a time of NATO's Bucharest summit in April 2008, where a declaration is issued saying that Ukraine and Georgia would become members of NATO. This was unacceptable. Russia made it perfectly clear that Georgia's and Ukraine's membership in the alliance was a huge strategic mistake which would have most serious consequences for pan-European security. In August 2008, emboldened by the Western promises, the Saakashvili government in Georgia attacked South Ossetia in the hope of reasserting its control. Russian peacekeepers also came under attack. That conflict was a consequence of the NATO Bucharest summit because the Georgians thought the West was sending them a signal that they could get uppity with Russia and the West would back them because they were going to become part of NATO. But that was not what happened. What happened was Russia defeating the invasion force and pushing it back. And that was trouble for Georgia because it could become part of NATO. The Bucharest Summit Declaration, and then what happens is you have a war, cause and effect. So the Americans and their allies should have understood by at least August 2008 that continuing to push to bring Ukraine into NATO was going to lead to a disaster. What did the United States and its allies in Europe do? They continued to push and push because they thought they could push NATO expansion down Russia's throat after 2008, the same way they did in 1999 and 2004. But they were wrong, and it all blew up in their face in 2014. And what did they again do? Cough and say, well, maybe the Russians have some legitimate security concerns? No, this is not the way they operate. They continue to double down. And the end result is that in 2022, you got a full-blown military conflict. So the expansion of NATO is primarily responsible. To put it in more general terms, what the West was trying to do was to turn Ukraine into a Western springboard on Russia's border. So we have the three Western strategies with Ukraine as a tool against Russia. The NATO expansion, EU expansion, and promoting a color revolution. What about the precipitating cause of the Ukraine conflict? It is the coup in Kyiv of February 2014, and that is also of enormous importance. The question is, what was the cause? It all started in November 2013. At that point, Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych was negotiating with the EU to form an association agreement that would bring the European Union and Ukraine much closer together. It was a step in the direction of incorporating Ukraine into the European Union, but in slightly different terms, incorporating Ukraine into the West. However, the EU was not offering Ukraine a particularly good deal, and besides, it would have had severe implications for Ukraine's close economic ties with Russia. Moscow made a better offer, which was very beneficial for Ukraine, while at the same time not forcing Ukraine to sever its ties with the EU. Yanukovych took it, and this led to a series of protests, which, when encouraged from the West, spiraled out of control as the government lost grip on the situation. The rioters, collectively known as the Maidan, seized control. And then what happened was a number of European foreign ministers, the German foreign minister, French foreign minister, flew to Kyiv, and the deal was worked out to have early elections that would have, in effect, removed Yanukovych from power anyway. The protesters back from the same West refused to accept the deal. Importantly, there were significant armed Nazi elements among them. As a result, Yanukovych fled, and the regime took over and repealed Ukraine's law guaranteeing its neutral status and changed the constitution to prioritize efforts to join NATO. A day after Yanukovych escaped on February 23rd, 2014, Ukraine's parliament voted to repeal minority language laws in the East. This was basically the Russian language. For your knowledge, roughly half of Ukraine was Russian-speaking. Since 2014, millions of people in Ukraine have been deprived of the right to use their native tongue. After the language ban, the regime unleashed repressions against the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, that for the second was established in the 10th century as a mainstay of spirituality and culture of the country. The assault on the Russian heritage in Ukraine continued, with cities and streets changing their historical names and monuments being demolished. Politicians, activists, journalists, and protesters, all who opposed the coup in Kyiv and the brutal crackdown on the rights and freedoms of the people, became targets of persecution, and many have lost their lives. Did the West condemn the coup and its beastly behavior? Not at all. As long as the regime swore allegiance to the West and pledged to continue its Russia-hating policy, it could rely on support from the Western capitals. We should mark 2014 as the time when the Western powers turned Ukraine into its proxy and began goading it towards a conflict with Russia. It was a little surprise that many Ukrainians rose in opposition to the color revolution in Kyiv. But the peaceful protest was put down with cruelty unseen before, and countless civilians were murdered by the regime's security apparatus and lawless paramilitaries. However, in several regions, patriots succeeded in putting up organized resistance. In Crimea, its citizens voted in a referendum to join Russia. In the East, Donetsk and Lugansk republics were proclaimed, and they repulsed all armed attacks by Kyiv, aiming to erase them from existence. Crimea was accepted into Russia in 2014. Donetsk and Lugansk were integrated in 2022, only after 8 years of Moscow trying to negotiate with Kyiv a diplomatic settlement of the conflict. Ultimately, in February 2022, Russia began a special military operation to protect the people of Donbass who had been mercilessly targeted by the Ukrainian uh, army and paramilitaries. The former regions of Ukraine, Zaporozhye and Kherson, were also accepted in the Russia following referenda in which people overwhelmingly voted for that. Coming back to what lies at the heart of the Ukrainian crisis, I want to emphasize that its root cause is the West to respect Russia's core national interests. Russia cannot accept that the West overwhelms Ukraine, a country that has great significance for Russia's security. This should be hardly surprising to the United States, which since 1823 has been guided by the Monroe Doctrine as a foundation of its foreign policy. The Monroe Doctrine basically says that the Western Hemisphere is the US backyard, and nobody from a distant region is allowed to move military forces into the Western Hemisphere. You may recall the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the US put the world on the brink of an all-out war after the Soviet Union stationed nuclear forces in Cuba. States made it very clear that it was unacceptable. No foreign power is allowed to military forces in the Western Hemisphere because that is what the Monroe Doctrine is all about. If anyone thinks that the Monroe Doctrine is a thing of the past, look at today's American policy pronouncements on Panama, Greenland, and Canada. If the United States doesn't like great powers coming into its neighborhood, it's hardly surprising that Russia didn't want NATO at its doorstep. Still, evidence that Russia has put a premium on diplomacy to resolve differences. Let me give you one example. Even after the start of the special military operation in Ukraine in February 2022, Moscow attempted to negotiate with Kiev. There were serious talks taking place in Istanbul involving the Turks, and Naftali, who was the Israeli prime minister at the time, was deeply involved in negotiating along a separate. At the center of the talks was the problem of NATO expansion into Ukraine, which was the principal cause of the conflict. And the West do not want to hear that argument, because if it is true, which it is, then the West is principally responsible for the bloodshed that is now taking place. And of course, the West doesn't want to be responsible. So the Baltic track and the Turkish track were operating together. And it tells the story very clearly that they had made significant progress in reaching an agreement. Bennett was talking in person to the leaders of both Russia and Ukraine. And what happened to produce failure? The answer is that the then US President Biden and British Prime Minister Johnson got involved and told Zelensky to abandon talks. If they had come in and encouraged Zelensky to try to figure out a way with Russia to shut this conflict down and work with Bennett and with the Turkish President Erdogan, we might have been able to shut the conflict down then. That was a missed opportunity. Now we have a few opening for diplomacy again. Donald Trump has declared its intent to contribute to a peaceful solution of the Ukraine conflict. It has instructed its team to engage with the Russian counterparts to negotiate, to identifying the contours of a future lasting peace. In 2024, President Putin laid out a basis for a settlement, including recognition of the non-territorial realities, Ukraine's neutral status, demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, ensuring the rights, freedoms, and interests of the Russian-speaking citizens in Ukraine, and cancellation of Western sanctions against Russia. In a short period of time since President Trump has committed to engage with Russia for peace in Ukraine, we have managed to achieve some meaningful progress. There is an agreement on a temporary ceasefire concerning strikes against energy infrastructure in Russia and Ukraine, and an agreement in principle on a Black Sea ceasefire to unblock trade in food and fertilizers. Moscow and Washington are also in talks to normalize their bilateral relations so recklessly undermined by the Biden administration. Now that Russia and the United States are on speaking terms, what are the challenges to restoring global peace and stability? It is clear that the most serious impediment to peace is now Europe. Deeply steeped in its Russia-hating mentality, Europe is bent on continuing its proxy war against Russia until Ukraine is completely wrecked by fighting. The Europeans are obsessed with the idea of inflicting a strategic defeat upon Russia, and some of them openly crave Russia's dismemberment, especially Belgium's the stance of the two former colonial empires, Britain and France, that are now conspiring to send troops to Ukraine. Must be told, there are not many backers of this plan, especially since Russia has made it clear that the presence of NATO forces in Ukraine under any guise is unacceptable. For many years, the Western states have been trying to beef up their security posture at the expense of Russia by discarding the fact that security is indivisible. There's no choice but to account for Russia's interests. NATO has irreparably discredited itself, and there is a requirement in a paradigm of Euro-Atlantic security nexus with a new concept we have proposed one, which is an inclusive, cooperative, consensus-based system that covers the entire Eurasia. There are certainly exceptions to the prevailing war-mongering mood in Europe, such as Hungary and now Slovakia, but the EU as an institution has lost its bearings and is stuck in the path of confrontation. Instead of developing options bringing back peace and stability, the EU is initiating a massive rearmament program broadcasting an intent to continue its confrontation with Russia going forward. What is the open invitation to India to participate? The EU is transforming itself into a European adjunct of NATO, aggressively peddling its agenda that not only disrespects other nations' traditional cultural values, but seeks to cancel them as retrograde and non-compatible with Europe's so-called progressive approach. At the same time, the EU guards itself with the protective flows and internal subsidies, distorts other states in its favor, and attempts to get hold of developing countries' natural resources. And balance India with promises of engagement and integrating India into their supply and production chains. Sounds good at first sight. Who can vouch for their credibility and trustworthiness? Can India expect the West to be its reliable partner going forward? This is a question to you, of course. And of course, it is your business. But from Russia's perspective, to have business with the West is a very risky deal, especially in terms of defense and security. It's high time the Western dominance ends and a reformed global governance takes over. Such institutions as BRICS promote the emergence of a multipolar world where India is destined to play an important role commensurate with its growing capabilities. BRICS is free from superpower domination, confrontation, and divisive atmosphere, attracts partners by its inclusive posture, spirit, and commitment to work out solutions to the pressing problems relevant to the vast majority of the international community. It has taken on board India's forward-looking agenda of development and growth for all. And so I'm saying that the global geopolitical churn, India can be confident of Russia's friendship and cooperation. Russia maintains its position as India's privileged and most trusted partner in defense, and is the only one that has never any conditions to our partnership. India knows that, cherishes that, and hopefully will utilize our attitude and our goodwill to its fullest advantage. Ours is a truly time-tested partnership, meticulously over decades, just like we have done. And it takes only one step to destroy to destroy it. I think we both should be very mindful of this. I look forward to questions you may have. Thank you for your attention.